In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural ice planet material in Blender. This procedural material is available for purchase on my Gumroad store, and you can also get access to the procedural material if you join my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description, and my Gumroad store and Patreon page are great ways to help support me and this channel. And if you'd like to purchase more of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material packs. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist on YouTube. And after this tutorial, if you'd like to learn how to make more procedural planets, then I have a procedural Earth tutorial and also a procedural lava planet. So links to those videos will be in the description if you'd like to check them out. Now before we create the procedural material, I am going to be doing this lighting setup so that the sunlight always points at the object, and then the atmosphere is also going to adapt where the sun is. So you'll only be able to see the atmosphere where the sun is pointing at the planet. And then we're also going to be creating a procedural stars texture, and we're going to put that into the world background. So first, let's create the procedural stars in the background. So I am in the shading tab, so I have the 3D view right here, and I'm going to hold down the Z button and go into the rendered view. And then I also have the shader nodes right here on this window. Now I want to edit the world background, so I'm going to click right up here on object, and I'm going to change this to world. So the world actually does use nodes, and you might need to click on the use nodes button or click on the use nodes button right here to make sure it is using nodes. Now right now the default background is just a gray color, and I want to set this to fully black so it looks more like space. But I want to create the stars, so to create the stars I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the Voronoi texture, and let's put the Voronoi right here behind the background. And then we are going to plug the distance into the color of the background, so this way instead of using a single color, we're going to be using the Voronoi texture. So here's what the Voronoi texture looks like. You can see it's a bunch of little circles, and I want to turn this scale up much higher so that there are lots of stars. So I'm going to turn the scale value to like a 200 on the Voronoi so that there are lots of stars. Now right now this still doesn't look like stars because it's mostly white and then the stars are black. So to fix this, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp, and we're going to stick the color ramp in between the Voronoi and the background. And then I'm going to click on the drop down arrow, and I'm going to click on flip color ramp. So this way, if I zoom in here, you can see the stars are now white, but the stars are way too big. So I'm going to click and drag the black tab out, and I'm going to drag the black tab really close to the white tab. And now the stars are much smaller. Now I do want to make the stars a bit more bright. So on the background strength, I'm going to turn this to like a 3. And that is pretty much it. So that is our procedural star texture. I do think the stars could be a little bit smaller. So I'm going to drag the black tab over just a little bit more so the stars are a bit smaller. But there we go, we now have procedural stars in the world background. So I can click right here on world, and I'm going to change this back to the object nodes. And I'll hold down the Z button and go back into the solid view. And I'm going to make this a bit smaller so the 3D space is bigger. So we're now going to be creating the planet, and we're going to add the light, and then we're going to set it up so that the atmosphere will follow where the sun is pointing. So I'm going to press Shift A, I'm going to go here to Mesh, and I'm going to add an icosphere. Now before you click away from the icosphere or move it around, right behind me you can click on the Add Icosphere Settings, just click on the little arrow there to open it up. Now on the subdivisions, I want to turn this up, and I want to turn it up to like a 6 so that it is pretty subdivided. And then using the Object Context menu, I can shade the object smooth. So we now have a nice smooth round sphere for the planet. And then I also added a camera and just pointed the camera at the sphere, and I can press the 0 on the numpad to go into the camera's view. So I now want to create a sunlight, and I want the sunlight to shine on the planet. So I'm going to press Shift A, and let's go here to light, and I'm going to add a sunlight. And then I can press G to grab and R to rotate, and just kind of rotate this over to the side so it's pointed at the planet. And I'm going to hold down the Z button and go up into the rendered view. Now right over here on the side panel, if I open this up, I can go right here to the object data properties with the light selected. And I'm going to turn the sunlight to a strength of 5 so that it is brighter. And then on the color here, I can just leave it to fully white. Now when I move the sunlight around, I want it to always be pointed at the planet. So what I'm going to do with the light selected is I'm going to click right here on the object constraint properties. And I can click on add object constraint, and I'm going to add the track 2. So then right here in the target, you can click right here and you can add the icosphere, or you can also click right here on the eyedropper and then you can select the icosphere. So if you select the light, you can press G to grab, and you can see as I move it around, it's always going to be pointed at the planet. Now, when I create the procedural material, I'm going to add an atmosphere, but I don't want to be able to see the atmosphere in the shadow, because in the shadow of the planet, there isn't any light shining down on the planet. So I mostly just want to be able to see the atmosphere up here where the light is shining down on the planet. And so to do that, I'm going to be creating a gradient, and then I will use the gradient to tell the atmosphere where it's going to be. Although if I move the sunlight around, I want the atmosphere to adapt with the sunlight. So we need to add a different object, and then we're going to make that object rotate with the sun. So when the sun rotates, the other object will rotate, and then that other object is going to control where the gradient is. So I will press Shift A, and let's go here to empty, and I'm going to add the plane axis. And then I can press S to scale and scale it up a little bit, and you can see it's in the very center there of the planet. Now, if I move the planet around, I also want the empty to move with it, because the empty is going to control where the gradient is for the atmosphere. So I'm going to select the empty, hold down the Shift key, and then select the planet. I can now press Control P, and that will bring up the parent settings, and I want to click on Object Keep Transform. So because we selected the empty and then lastly selected the planet, the empty is going to move along with the planet. So the empty can still move on its own, but if I move the planet, you can see the empty is moving along with the planet. Now, if I rotate the light, I want the empty to rotate as well. So I'm going to click on the empty, and let's click on Add Object Constraint, and I can add again a Track to Object Constraint. And then let's click on the eyedropper here, and I can select the sun object or just find it in the drop down. So now if I move the light around, you can see that the empty is also following along with the light. So we are now ready to start creating the procedural material. Now, when I'm creating the procedural setup, I am going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on. So if you don't have that add-on enabled, you can click on Edit and go to the Preferences. And then over there in the Add-ons tab, you can search for Node Wrangler, and you can just check mark the Node Wrangler add-on. So it's built into Blender, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So I'm just going to select the icosphere here, and then in the shader nodes right here, I can click on New, and I can just rename this to Procedural Ice Planet. And then also hold down the Z button and move your mouse up into the rendered view so you can see that in the rendered view. So we're going to start off by creating the atmosphere. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the texture coordinate node. Let's click on the texture coordinate, and I'm going to drop it here. And then to use the feature of the Node Wrangler add-on, you can Control Shift and select different nodes, and that's going to add the viewer node, and you can preview the node on the object. And I'm going to Control Shift and click down and continue to click on the texture coordinate until we can see the object coordinates. So we're going to be using the object coordinates to create a gradient for the atmosphere. So right now with the texture coordinate, we have the X, Y, and Z axes, but I want to split up the X, Y, and Z axes and then only use one of them. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the separate X, Y, Z. Let's click on this, and I'm going to drop it here in the wire, and then you can Control Shift and select the separate XYZ. And if I hold down the Control and Shift key and continue to click down the separate XYZ, it's going to show me the X, the Y, and the Z. And you can see that it's creating a gradient on the X-axis, the Y-axis, and the Z-axis. Now I want to use the Z-axis, so I'm going to Control Shift and select the separate XYZ until we can preview the Z-axis. Now I don't want the atmosphere to just be pointed up, I want it to point towards the sunlight. So this is where the empty comes in. So instead of using the planet's rotation to make the gradient, I'm going to use the empty's rotation to make the gradient. So on the texture coordinate node, I can click on this object and I can just select the empty. Or you can also just click on the eyedropper and then you can select the empty object. So now that the empty is in the object texture coordinate, when I select the sun and rotate it, the gradient is going to move, and that's because the empty is rotating towards the sun. Now I want to make this more contrasty, so let's press Shift A. I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp node, and we're going to stick the color ramp node right here after the separate XYZ. And then I can drag the white tab towards the black tab, and when I do that, it's going to be a bit more sharp and a bit more contrasty. So I'm just going to drag it to about there so that it's much more white. And the fade there of the gradient is also going to be smaller. Now I want to be able to mostly see the atmosphere on the edges of the planet, but then in the center I want it to be more subtle. So I'm going to press B for the box select and just box select these nodes and bring them up. So I have a bit more space here. So I'm now going to press Shift A, then I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the layer weight node. Let's add that in and stick it here. So if I Control Shift and select it twice, we can preview the facing, and you can see that with the facing, it's going to be lighter on the edges, but then in the center, it's going to be darker. And I want to make this much darker, so I'm going to turn the blend value on the layer weight to just like a 0.1. And then I also want to have a bit more control over this, so I'm going to press Shift A, go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp node, and we're going to stick the color ramp node right here, so the facing from the layer weight is going to go into the color ramp. And then if I drag these around, that's going to change the colors. So I'm going to bring the black tab out just a little bit, and then I can click on the white tab, and I'm going to click on the color, and I'm just going to make this a bit darker of a gray color so it's not quite as visible. And we will play around with this later when we can actually see what the atmosphere is looking like. So we now have this texture here, which is lighter on the sides and then darker on the inside. And then if I Control Shift and select the color ramp, we also have the gradient. So I want to mix these together so that you can just see the atmosphere on the side where the sun is pointing, and then it's going to also be more visible on the edges. So I'm going to select the color ramp, hold down the Shift key, select the other color ramp, and then I can press Control 0. So Control 0 is using a node wrangler feature, and it's going to add the mix RGB, and I can open this up and bring it over here. Now I just want to add the dark values, so I'm going to click on the mix here, and I'm going to change this to darken. And then I want to take the top color ramp and I want to put the color into the factor. And then I want the bottom color ramp to be going into color 1. So now I want to take color 2 and I'm going to make this fully black. And so because I made color 2 fully black, now the back of the planet is fully dark, but then where the sun is pointing at the planet, you can see that lighter area right there. And so wherever the color is lighter, that's where the atmosphere is going to show up. So all of these nodes here are being used to create the atmosphere. So I'm going to press B for the box select and just box select all these nodes. And then I can press Control J, and Control J is going to join them into a frame. And then if I click on the frame, I can press F2 and that's going to give the frame a label. And I'm just going to rename this to atmosphere because all these nodes are being used to create the atmosphere. Now I need to create some sort of atmosphere material, and I want that material to be emitting light and glowing. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the emission material. Let's add the emission material, and I'm going to stick it right here in the atmosphere frame. So the principled shader is going to be the planet's surface, and then the emission material is going to be the atmosphere. So we need to add a node to mix the two shaders together. So I can select the principled shader, hold down the Shift key and select the emission, and then I can press Control 0, and this time, because these were both shaders, it added the mix shader instead of the mix RGB when I pressed Control 0. So it added the mix shader, and it's going to mix these two shaders together, and I'm actually going to bring the viewer node out here and the material output over here. And then I can Control Shift and select the mix shader to preview it. And then just so that we can see this a bit better, let's turn the principled shader to like a gray color, and then this color here on the emission, I'm just going to make this like a blue color for the atmosphere. Now right now the factor is just going to blend between just using the principled or just using the emission, but I instead want to be able to see the atmosphere on the edges, but then I want to mostly be able to see the planet. So that is where the atmosphere textures come in. So I can take the darken here from the atmosphere, and I'm going to put this into the factor. And so the factor is going to control where it's going to be the emission and where it's going to be the principled. Now I actually want to switch this because it's mostly using the emission. So I'm going to click and drag and drop the emission into the bottom shader, and then the principled is going to go to the top shader. So now if I look here on the edges, you can see a very subtle atmosphere. Now it's very subtle and I want to make it much more strong. So I'm going to turn the strength value here on the emission to like a 25. So just a 25, and that way it is going to be much brighter. Now the problem with this is that it's way too visible. So I can take this color ramp here from the layer weight and I can turn down the gray value, and then that'll make it less visible. So I'm going to click on the gray tab here, click on the color, and I'm going to make this a darker color. And you can see as I turn it down, it's going to be less visible. And if you want to use the same exact gray color that I'm using, then if you go over to the hex value, you can punch in a hex value of 7D, 7D, 7D. So that's the color that I'll be using. And then right now, this is also too much of a bright blue, so I want to make this a darker blue. So on the color right here on the emission, I'm going to make this a more saturated blue color and a little bit darker. And again, if you'd like to use the same exact color that I'm using, then over here on the hex value, you can punch in 318CFF. So that is the color that I'll be using for the atmosphere. So now if I select the sunlight and move the sunlight around, you can see the atmosphere is going to adapt. So that is it for the atmosphere, so we can now create the surface of the planet. So let's navigate down here to the principled shader. So to start off, I'm going to create a texture which is going to be the ice and the water on the ice planet surface. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to start by adding a checker texture. Let's drop the texture right here, and then I can Control Shift and select it to preview it. Now this doesn't look anything like an organic natural planet, and so I'm going to put a node in here to distort the checker texture. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's put the noise texture after the checker texture. And then with the noise texture selected, I can press Control T, that's using a feature of the node wrangler, and it's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping. Now I don't need the mapping, so I can press X to delete it, and then I want to use the object coordinates from the texture coordinate, so I'm going to pull out a wire from the object and let's stick that into the vector. And by using the object coordinates, it's going to place the texture on the object more evenly. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. So I want to turn the scale down to just like a 1, and then I do want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail all the way to the max, which is 15. And then I do want to add a bit more roughness, so on the roughness value, let's turn this to a 0.75. So I can now Control Shift and select the checker texture, and I want the noise texture to be distorting the checker texture. So I'm going to take the color here from the noise texture, and I'm going to put that into the vector. So this way you can now see that the noise texture is distorting the checker texture, and so those little checker areas now are very rough on the edges, and so it looks much more like a planet now. And then I do want to change these colors here, so I'm going to take color 2 and I'm going to make this fully dark, and then I'm going to click on color 1 and I'm going to make this kind of a gray color. And the hex value that I'll be using for color 1 is going to be 9 6 times. And then let's also change the scale of the checker texture, so I'm going to turn the scale to like a 5.76. So a 5.76, I find that to be pretty good. So the noise texture and the checker texture are creating the ice and water. So with both of these nodes selected, you can hold down the Shift key and select both of them. I'm going to press Control J, that's going to add a frame, and then if I click on the frame, I can press F2 to add a label, and I'm just going to rename this to ice and water, just to organize my nodes very well, ice and water. And then I can bring the texture coordinate down, because we're going to be creating some more textures and I want to use the object coordinates. So let's now add some planet details. So to add the planet details, I'll press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the Voronoi texture, and let's stick the Voronoi texture right here under the checker texture. And then I can Control Shift and select it to preview it. And then I want to use the object coordinates, so let's take the object and put that into the vector of the Voronoi texture. Now right here on the F1, I'm going to change this to distance to edge. And this is going to create a really cool cracked texture. And then I will leave the Voronoi texture scale to the default, which is 5. Now I want to distort this to make it much more noisy and random. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the noise texture, and let's put the noise texture here before the Voronoi. So the object can go into the vector, and then the color from the noise texture can go into the Voronoi. And so you can see the noise texture is now distorting the Voronoi, and it looks much more random. Now on the scale here on the noise texture, I'm going to turn this to like a 2, and then I'm going to turn the detail all the way to the max, which is 15, so it's very detailed. And then let's also turn the roughness value to like a 0.6, so it is more rough. So this texture here is going to be the planet details. So I'm going to press B for the box select and just box select these nodes. And then I can press Control J to join them together into a frame. And then if you select the frame, you can press F2 to rename this. And I'm going to rename this to Planet Details. So now let's create one more set of textures, and that's going to be some mountains. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for another Voronoi texture, and let's stick this here underneath the top one. And then again, I want to use the object coordinates, so let's put the object into the vector of the Voronoi. So let's Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture to preview it. So I'm going to take the bottom value here, and I'm going to change this to the Minkowski, and then I'm going to take the F1, and I'm going to change this to F2. And then let's also turn the scale to like a value of 8. So this is giving us a cool texture with a bunch of little lines going back and forth, and so we're going to use this to create the mountains. Now the mountains need to be much more random and noisy, so again I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for another noise texture, and let's put the noise texture right here before the Voronoi. So the noise texture is going to distort the placement of the Voronoi. And let's turn the scale here on the noise texture to like a 1.5, and then let's make it very detailed, so I'll turn the detail all the way to the max, which is 15. Now it's actually pretty hard to see the mountains, so I want to make this darker so that the mountains are more visible. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the math node, and let's stick the math node after the Voronoi. Now if I change the value of the math node, I'm going to change this to divide, so it's under functions divide. And then if I change the value here, I can make it darker. So I'm going to change the value to like a 21, and this way it is much darker, and you can really see that texture there for the mountains. So then I will press B for the box select. I'm just going to box select all these nodes, and I can press Control J. That's going to add them together into a frame, and then I can click on the frame, and I can press F2 to add a label, and I'm going to change this to mountains. Alright, so we have the ice and water, the planet details, and the mountains. So we're going to join them all together and then put them into the principled shader. So I first want to add the ice and water and the planet details together. So I'm going to select the checker and then hold down the Shift key and select the Voronoi. And then I can press Control 0. That is going to add the mix RGB, so I can open this up and just bring it over. And then let's Control Shift and select the mix RGB to preview it. So I want to take the checker texture and I'm going to put that into the factor, and then I'm going to take the Voronoi from the planet details and I'm going to put that into color 1. So I can now click on color 2 and I'm going to make this fully white. So we've now mixed the planet details and the ice and water together, and then I want to add the mountains on top. So I'm going to click on this mix RGB, I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it right here. Now I only want to add the light values, so if I click on the mix here, I can change this to lighten, and that way we can just add the light values from the mountains. So I'm going to take the value on the divide, and I'm going to put this into color 2, and then this mix here is going to be going into color 1. And then I want to add all of the light values, so on the factor here I can turn this up to 1, and you can see as I turn this up it is adding the light values from the mountains. Now it's actually kind of hard to see the mountains, and that's because the mountains aren't very contrasty, so I want to add a node in here to make it more contrasty. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp node, and I'm going to stick this here in between the divide and the lighten. So I can now drag these two tabs together, and that's going to make it more contrasty. And I actually want to flip these two colors, so the white is going to be over here, and then I'm going to drag the black tab really close to it, and that's going to make it more contrasty. And I can also Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview what it's doing. So you can see if I bring these together, you're just going to be able to see the lightest part of the mountains. And I'll also bring the white tab out just a little bit to make the mountains a bit lighter, and then bring the black tab over. So something like that is pretty good. So I can now Control Shift and select the lighten to preview what that's doing, and you can see that there are those little white areas where the mountains are. So now that we've mixed all these textures together, I can put them into the principled shader. So I'm first going to take the color from the lighten, and I'm going to put that into the base color, and then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now the colors don't look very good, they're just white and black, and I want to instead make the colors white and blue to make it look like an ice planet. planet. So I'll press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp node, and then I'll stick the color ramp in between the lighten and the principled shader. So I'm going to bring the white tab out, and then I'm also going to bring the black tab in, and just bring those together so they're more contrasty. I'll bring the black tab to about here, and then I'll bring the white tab to about here. Now, instead of this being black, I want to make it blue. So on the black tab, I'm going to click on the color, and I'm going to make this fully white, and then make it kind of a light blue color. And if you want to use the exact color that I'm using, you can click on the hex value, and you can punch in 49.8C_D9. So that is the blue color that I'm using for the planet's surface. So that is going to be it for the base color of the planet. Now I also want to add some values into the roughness so that some parts are more shiny and some parts are more rough. So I'm going to click on this color here, I'm going to pull out a wire and put that into the roughness. Now I want to add a color ramp in here to control the roughness. So I'm going to click on the color ramp, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop this color ramp right here. Now if I select the color ramp, I can click on the backspace, and that is going to reset the color ramp. You can also just click right here on the arrow and click on Reset Color Ramp. And that is actually something that I learned from a YouTube comment, so thank you for whoever gave me that tip. So select the color ramp and then click on the backspace, and that will reset the color ramp. So I actually want to flip these values now, so I'm just going to drag these two values and flip them so the black is over here and the white is over here. And then the planet still is looking a bit too rough, so I'm going to click on the white tab, and I'm going to click on the color, and I'm going to make this more gray, and you can see as I make it more gray, the planet is going to be more shiny. And the hex value that I'll be using for this gray color is going to be A6, A6, A6. And I think that is a good amount of shininess, so it is pretty shiny but not too shiny. Now to make this look like an icy planet, I'm going to be turning up the transmission value. So normally the transmission value is used to kind of create like a glass shader, and it's used to add transparency. And so because ice and water is a bit transparent, I'm going to be turning up the transparency value, and that'll make it look more like an icy watery planet. So I'm going to take the lighten color here, and I'm going to put that into the transmission value. And then I want to add a color ramp to have more control over this. So I'm going to click on the color ramp here. Let's press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can just drop it right here, going from the wire between the lighten to the transmission. And then again, you can click on the backspace, and that's going to reset the color ramp. Now on the black tab here, I want to make this fully white, and then I'm going to click on the white tab, and I'm going to make this a bit darker. So this is going to be kind of a light gray, because I don't want the entire planet to be transparent. If I turn this all the way up to fully white, you can see the planet is basically going to act like a glass planet, and it is see-through, but I don't want it to be fully see-through. So on this white tab here on the right side, I'm going to make this just kind of like a light gray. And if you want to use the same light gray color over here on the hex value, I'll be using a hex value of 9 6 times. Now if I control shift and select the mix shader to preview the final material, if I navigate here to the back of the planet, you can see the planet kind of looks transparent and it looks like glass. And the sunlight is actually shining light through the entire planet because we're using that transmission value. But I don't want there to be any light where the sun isn't pointing, because the planet is in space, and so space is very dark, and so I just want to be able to see the light where the sunlight is pointing at the planet. So what I'm going to do here is press Shift A. I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix RGB, and we're going to stick the mix RGB right here after this color ramp before the transmission. Now I want to mix together the gradient so that you can't see any of the transmission back here where it's dark. So if I control shift and select this color ramp from the atmosphere, you can see that we already have a gradient, and the gradient is going to adapt depending on where the sunlight is. So what I'm going to do is pull out a wire from this color ramp here on the atmosphere, and I'm going to stick this into the factor here of this mix RGB before it goes into the transmission. And then I can control shift and select the mix shader again. And I want this color ramp here to be going into color 1, so I can now click on color 2, and I'm going to make this fully black. And so by making it fully black, now there isn't going to be any transmission on the dark area of the planet. So this is looking very cool, and we're almost finished, but there is still one thing that I want to add, and that is some bump all over the planet, because I do want the planet surface to be a bit bumpy, and then I also want the mountains to be bumping out. So let's first take this light in here. I'm going to pull out a wire, and I'm going to stick that into the normal of the principled shader to give it some bump. Now we need to convert this to normal data because this is color data, but then this is normal data. So we can't just plug this directly into the normal, we need to convert it to normal data. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the bump node, and we're going to stick the bump node right here between the lighten and the normal. Now it's still not converting it correctly, and that is because we need the lighten here to be going into the height value. And now it's actually converting it to normal data, so if you zoom in closely to the planet, you can see it's very bumpy. Now that bump is way too strong, so I'm going to take the strength value and I'm just going to turn it way down to like a 0.1, so it is less strong, but it still is very bumpy. Now I also want to make the mountains much more bumpy. So to do this, I'm going to click on this bump here, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it down here. And then the normal can go into the normal, so this way we can mix two bump maps together. So we now have this extra height value that we can add data into. So I can take the divide from the mountains, and I'm going to put that into the height value of the bump. And then I can Control Shift and select the mix shader to preview the final material. Now the mountains aren't very bumpy, so on the strength value, I'm going to turn this up to like a 0.3, so it is much more bumpy. Now you can see that the mountains are bumpy all over the place, but I just want the mountains to be bumpy on the tips. So to make the mountains more bumpy just on the tips of the mountains, I can press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for another color ramp, and we're going to stick the color ramp here in between the divide and the bump. And then I can drag these values together, and that's going to make it more contrasty. And I'm also going to Control Shift and select the bump so I can preview what it's doing. Now I actually want to flip these values, so I'm going to bring the white tab over here, and I'm going to bring it all the way to the back, and then I'm going to bring the black tab closer and closer. And so as I bring the black tab over, it's going to be more contrasty, and so now I can just see that bump of the mountains. So I'm just going to bring the black tab to about here. So now the mountains are just bumpy here and there. So I can now Control Shift and select the final mix shader, and if you zoom in there to the mountains, you can see the mountains are much more bumpy than the rest of the planet. Now there is just one more thing I want to do before I finish the material. I want to add just a tiny bit of atmosphere over the entire planet. So if I go up here to the atmosphere, I can go to this color ramp, and this black tab is removing some of the atmosphere. So if I click on the black tab, I can click right here, and I'm going to bring this up just so that it is very, very dark gray. So it is almost black, but it's just going to be a very dark gray. And if I turn this up more and more, it's going to show more of the atmosphere. So if you want there to be a very strong atmosphere, you could turn this up, but I'm just going to make this very, very dark, but not fully black, just so that there's a little bit of atmosphere over the entire planet. And the hex value that I'll be using for this very dark color is going to be a hex value of 0C, 0C, 0C. So let's go over the render settings. We'll render out the image, and then we're going to do some compositing to make the image look really nice, and also add some glow there around the atmosphere. So I'm going to pull out the side panel here, and I'm going to go right up here to the render properties. So if you open up the sampling tab, I'm going to be using 100 samples here on the render samples. And then also if you go down here to the color management, I'm going to use the view transform of Filmic, and then I'm going to set the look here to high contrast, and that'll pop out the colors and make it look more saturated. So make sure you save the Blender file, and then to render this, you can click on render and click on render image. And the render finished. So we can now jump over to the compositing tab to do some compositing and make the image look really nice. So let's click right up here on the compositing tab, and then make sure you click on use nodes, and also click on the backdrop so we can see it in the background. And it should give you a render layers and a composite. And then because we turned on the Node Wrangler add-on, I can Control Shift and select the render layers, and that's going to add the viewer node so we can preview it in the background. And then I want to connect these wires together, so I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and I can right click and drag over both wires and then let go, and that is going to add a reroute, so it's going to combine these together, and so now we can add all of the compositing nodes right here in the single wire. So to start off, I want to denoise the image just to smooth it out and make it look a bit nicer, so I'm going to press Shift A, Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the denoise node, and I can just drop the denoise node right here. And then I'm going to click on the accurate, and I'm just going to change it to fast so it works a bit faster. And I find that the quality really doesn't look any different, so I just use the fast denoise. Now I also want to do a little bit of color correction, so I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the RGB curves, and let's stick this here after the denoise. So I'm going to pull out a dot here and just kind of bring it up, and then I'm also going to click right here to add another dot, and I'm going to pull this dot down, and by adding this curve here, it's going to make it a bit more contrasty, so the lighter parts are going to be a bit lighter and the darker parts are going to be a bit darker. And that's a bit too strong, so let me just bring this back a little bit so it's not quite that strong. Now I also want to add a glare around the planet to make the planet atmosphere glowing, so I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the glare node, and let's stick the glare node right here after the RGB curves. Now on the glare settings, I'm going to change this from streaks to the fog glow, and then I also want this to be very big, so I'm going to turn the size up to 9. And then it is taking a while to composite, and that's because of the denoise node. So I can click on the denoise node, and I'm going to press the M key, and the M key is going to mute the node, so now it will not be using the node, and so it will composite much faster. Now you can see the glare node isn't really doing anything, and that's because there isn't any super bright values in this image. So I'm going to take the threshold, and I'm going to turn this way down to like a 0.06. I find that a 0.06 looks pretty good for this scene, but you could change that to your liking. And so by turning down the threshold, it's going to make more of the light values glowing. And then on the medium here, I'm going to change this to low, and if I change this to low, then that glow is going to be a little bit brighter. Or if you wanted more glare, you could duplicate the glare node and add another one. Now I also want to add a sharpen filter just to make the planet look a bit more sharp. I find that it does help to add a bit more detail. So let's press Shift A. I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the filter node, and let's stick the filter node right here. And then instead of it being soften, I'm going to change it to the box sharpen. Now the box sharpen is going to make it way too sharp, so let's turn the factor to just like a 0.3 so it's less strong. So now this is going to make the planet look more sharp, and right now it does look a bit too sharp and it does look a bit noisy, but once we add the denoise node, it'll smooth it out a bit and it'll look better. And then I do also just want to add like a sci-fi lens distortion effect, so I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the lens distortion, and let's put that after the box sharpen. And I just want to add a very small amount of lens distortion, so on the dispersion here, I'm going to turn this to a 0.01. Just a 0.01, so it is going to be pretty subtle, but now kind of on the edges of the image, it's just having a little bit of a lens distortion, and so those stars are kind of being pulled to the side. So now I can click on the denoise node, and I can press the M key. That's going to unmute the node, and so it will actually denoise the image. And the compositing is finished. So now to save this image, I'm going to press the F11 key, and that's going to take me to the render result. Now if I click on the drop down here, I want to instead preview the viewer node, and that'll preview the final compositing. So there's the finished planet, and I really like how detailed it is. So to save this image, you can just click on image, and you can click on save as, and you can save the image to your computer. So that's going to be it for this tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel, as well as purchase this procedural material, then you can get that over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I'll have the links in the description. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase more of my materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. And if you'd like to learn how to create more procedural planets in Blender, then I also have a procedural lava planet tutorial and a procedural earth tutorial, so I'll have the links in the description if you'd like to check those out. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.